There Was a Country by Chinua Achebe. Part 1. Pioneers of a New Frontier. My father was born in the last third of the 19th century, an era of great cultural, economic, and religious upheaval in Igbo land. His mother had died in her second birth, and his father, Achebe, a refugee from a bitter civil war, did not long survive his wife. And so my father was raised by his maternal uncle, Udo. It was this maternal uncle, as fate would have it, who received in his compound the first party of English clergy in his town. The new arrivals, missionaries of a new religion, Christianity, had already conquered the Yoruba heartland and was expanding their footprint in Igbo land and the rest of southern Nigeria with their potent, irresistible tonic of evangelism and education. A story is told of how Udo, a very generous and tolerant man, finally asked his visitors to move to a public playground on account of their singing, which he considered too dismal for a living man's compound. But he did not discourage his young nephew from associating with the singers. My father was an early Christian convert and a good student. By 1904, he was deemed to have received enough education at St. Paul's Teachers College in Awka to be employed as a teacher and an evangelist in the Anglican Mission. He was a brilliant man who deeply valued education and read a great deal, mainly the Bible and religious books, periodicals, and almanacs from the Church Mission Society. My mother, Janet Anechechi Ilebunam, was an extraordinary woman. As a student of the legendary missionary and evangelist Miss Edith Warner, she received a primary school education, which was a phenomenal feat at the time, especially for a woman. My mother joined my father on his travels through much of Igbo land to spread the gospel. My parents were among the first of their people to successfully integrate traditional values with the education and new religion brought by the Europeans. I still marvel at how wholeheartedly they embrace strangers from thousands of miles away with their different customs and beliefs. It is from these two outstanding and courageous individuals that my 5 siblings, Frank, Zenobia, John, Augustine, and Grace, and I got our deep love for education and the pursuit of knowledge. The Magical Years. On November 16, 1930, in Nnobi, near my hometown of Ogidi, Providence ushered me into a world of a cultural crossroads. By then, a long-standing clash of Western and African civilizations had generated deep conversations and struggles between their respective languages, religions, and cultures. Crossroads possesses a certain dangerous potency. Anyone born there must wrestle with their multi-headed spirit and return to his or her people with the boon of prophetic vision, or accept, as I have, life's interminable mysteries. My initiation into the complicated world of Ndibo was at the hands of my mother and my older sister, Zenobia, who furnished me with a number of wonderful stories from our ancient Igbo tradition. The tales were steeped in intrigue, spiced with oral acrobatics and song, but always resolute in their moral message. My favorite stories stirred the tortoise Mbe and celebrated his mischievous escapades. As a child, sitting quietly, mesmerized, story time took a whole new world of meaning and importance. I realized, reminiscing about these events, that it is little wonder I decided to become a storyteller. Later in my literary career, I traveled back to the magic of the storytelling of my youth to write my children's book, How the Leopard Got His Claws, Chike and the River, The Drum, A Children's Story, and The Flute. When I think about my mother, the first thing that comes to my mind is how clearly the description, the strong, silent type, fit her. Mother was neither talkative nor timid, but seemed to exist on several planes, often quietly escaping into the inner casement of her mind, where she engaged in deep reflective thought. It was from her that I learned to appreciate the power and solace in silence. Mother's education prepared her for leadership, and she distinguished herself in the church and as the head of a group of expatriate women from the ancient town of Oka who were married in Ogidi. She always treated others with respect and exuded a calm self-confidence. Mother brought a remarkable understated elegance to every activity in which she engaged. She had a particularly attractive way of making sure she got her point across without being overbearing or intimidating. It is her peaceful determination to tackle barriers in her world that nailed down a very important element of my development, the willingness to bring about change gently. We were Christians, though the interreligious struggle was still evident in our time. There were occasions when one would suddenly realize there were sides, and one was on one or another. Perhaps the most important event that illustrates this was what has come to be known in my family as the Kola Nut incident. The story came out that a neighbor who was a relative of mine and someone the Christians will refer to as a heathen was passing on the road one day and watched quietly as my mother pulled down a small kola nut branch from a tree in her compound and picked a ripe fruit. Now, one often forgets that there were taboos about picking kola nuts. Traditionally, no one was allowed to pick them from the tree. They were supposed to ripen, fall, and then be collected from the ground, and by men, not by women. The kola nut was a sacred fruit and had a very distinct and distinguished role to play in Igbo life and culture. The neighbor reported this incident to the men folk, who then exaggerated the insult to our traditions. But mother insisted that she had every right to pick the fruit, particularly from a tree in her own compound. I did not think up to that moment that my mother was a fighter. There was pressure to punish my mother, though it did not go anywhere in the end. Looking back, one can appreciate the fact that she had won a battle for Christianity, women's rights, and freedom. The most powerful memories of my father are the ones of him working as a catechist and a teacher. He read constantly and had a small library. My father also had a number of colleges and maps hanging on the wall and books that he encouraged his children to read. He would often walk us through the house telling stories linked to each prized possession. It was from him that I was exposed to the magic in the mere title of William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, and to an Igbo translation of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. The Bible played an important role in my education. My parents often read passages out loud to us during prayer time and encouraged us, when we were all able, to read and memorize several passages. Sunday school continued this tradition of Christian evangelical education, this time with several other children from the village. Education was so important to my father that he often would sponsor a bright child from an underprivileged background, reminding us that he too, as an orphan, had received Providence's benefaction. The center of my family's activities was St. Philip's Church, Ogidi, a large Gothic-style parish church that my father helped establish. It was constructed on an impressive open ilo, or piece of open grass, on the outskirts of Ogidi. It was an imposing structure for its time, built with wood, cement, mud, and stone. Local law holds that my father took part in the building of the church from its foundations. My father also helped conduct Sunday service, translate sermons into Igbo, and arrange the sanctuary and vestry. I remember waking up early to help out, carrying his bag for him as we set out at cockcrow for the parish church. Eucharist on Sundays often lasted more than 2 hours. For those who were not asleep by the end of the proceedings, the fire and brimstone sermons from the pulpit made attendance worthwhile. There was an occasional outburst of uncontrollable laughter when the rector, an Englishman, enthusiastically drank all the remaining wine at the end of the communion, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. A crowd favorite was the inaccurate translations of Igbo words into English, such as the word Ike, which is an Igbo word that can mean strength or buttocks, depending on the skill or mischief of the translator. I can say that my whole artistic career was probably sparked by this tension between the Christian religion of my parents, which we followed in our home, and the retreating older religion of my ancestors, which fortunately for me was still active outside my home. I still had access to a number of relatives who had not converted to Christianity and were called heathens by the new converts. When my parents were not watching, I would often sneak off in the evenings to visit some of these relatives. They seemed so very content in their traditional way of life and worship. Why would they refuse to become Christians like everyone else around them? I was intent on finding out. My great-uncle, Udo Oshin, was able to bestride both worlds with great comfort. He held one of the highest titles in all of Igbo land, Ozo. I was very interested in my great-uncle's religion, and talking to him was an enriching experience. I wouldn't give up anything for that, including my own narrow, if you like, Christian background. In Igbo cosmology, there are many gods. A person could be in a good stead with one god and not the other. Ogugu could kill a person despite an excellent relationship with Udo. As a young person, that sort of complexity meant little to me. A later understanding would reveal the humility of the traditional religion with greater clarity. Igbo sayings and proverbs are far more valuable to me as a human being in understanding the complexity of the world than the doctrinaire, self-righteous strain of the Christian faith I was taught. This other religion is also far more artistically satisfying to me. However, as a catechist son, I had to suppress this interest in our traditions to some extent, at least the religious component. We were church people after all, helping the local church spread Christianity. The relationship between my father and his uncle Udo was instructive to me. There was something deep and mystical about it, judging from the reverence I heard in my father's voice whenever he spoke about his old uncle. My father was a man of few words, and I have always regretted that I did not ask him more questions. But he took pains to tell me what he thought I needed to know. He told me, for instance, in a rather oblique way of his one attempt to convert his uncle Udo. It must have been in my father's youthful, heady, proselytizing days. His uncle pointed to the awesome roll of insignia of his three titles, Ichiozo, Ido Idemili, Ime Omalo. "What shall I do to these?" he asked my father. It was an awesome question. He had essentially asked, what do I do to whom I am? What do I do to history? An orphan child born into adversity, heir to the commotions, barbarities, and rampant upheavals of a continent in disarray. It was not at all surprising that my father would welcome the remedy proffered by diviners and interpreters of a new word of God. But my great-uncle, a leader in his community, a moral, open-minded man, a prosperous man who had prepared such a great feast when he took the Ozo title that his people gave him a praise name for it, was he to throw all that away because some strangers from afar had said so? At first glance, it seemed to me that my father, a deeply religious man, was not tolerant of our Asian traditions and religion. As he got older, however, I noticed that he became more openly accommodating of the old ways of doing things. By this time, he had developed quite a reputation as a pious, disciplined, honest catechist. He was widely known as Onyenkuzi, the teacher, and the villagers found him very trustworthy. Strangers would often drop off valuables at our house for father's safekeeping. Those two, my father and his uncle, formed the dialect that I inherited. Udo stood fast in what he knew, but he also left room for my father to seek other answers. The answer my father found in the Christian faith solved many problems, but by no means all. As a young person, my perspective of the world benefited, I think, from this dichotomy. I wasn't questioning in an intellectual way which way was right or better. I was simply more interested in exploring the essence, the meaning, the worldview of both religions. By approaching the issues of tradition, culture, literature, and language of our ancient civilization in that manner, without judging but scrutinizing, a treasure trove of discovery was opened up to me. I often had periods of oscillating faith as I grew older, periods of doubt when I quietly pondered and deeply questioned the absolute teachings or the interpretations of religion. I struggled with the certitude of Christianity. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not its accuracy, because as a writer, one understands that there should be such latitude, but the desolation, the acerbity of its meaning, the lack of options for the outsider, the other. I believe that this question has subconsciously deeply influenced my writing. This is not peculiar or particularly unique, as many writers from Du Bois to Camus, Sartre, and Baldwin to Morrison have always struggled with the conundrum of the outsider, the other, in other ways, in their perspective locales. My father had a lot of praise for the missionaries and their message, and so do I. I am a prime beneficiary of the education that the missionaries made a major component of their enterprise. But I have also learned a little more skepticism about them than my father had any need for. Does it matter, I ask myself, that centuries before European Christianity sailed down to us in ships to deliver the gospel and save us from darkness, other European Christians, also sailing in ships, delivered us to the transatlantic slave trade and unleashed darkness in our world? Every generation must recognize and embrace the task it is peculiarly designed by history and by providence to perform. From where I stand now, I can see the enormous value of my great-uncle Udo Oshin and his example of fidelity. I also salute my father, Isaiah Achebe, for the 35 years he served as a Christian evangelist and for all the benefits his work and the work of others like him brought to our people. My father's great gift to me was his love of education and his recognition that whether we look at one human family or we look at human society in general, growth can come only incrementally.